Then there's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. It is a quiet fall afternoon here at the state capitol in Sacramento, but that quiet belies the anticipation and vigilance that the Capitol community is already feeling as the legislature gets ready to convene its 2023-2024 session, saying final farewells to departing legislative colleagues who are termed out and leaving office, preparing to greet a new cohort of Senate and Assembly freshman lawmakers who will be joining their ranks and being sworn in on December 5th, preparing policy agendas for the new session focused on addressing the worsening effects of climate change, housing, education, further shoring up what could now be the fourth largest economy here in the world, here in California, crafting a new state budget that might not have as robust a surplus as it has had over the past few years. So on this edition of Then There's California, on this quiet but below the surface very busy fall afternoon in Sacramento, what better person to get some perspective on the aforementioned issues and more than the highly regarded Dean of California Public Policy and Legislative Process, State Senator John Laird of Santa Cruz, representing California's 17th Senate District. Senator Laird is beginning the second half of his first four-year term in the Senate, where he has been the chair of the Senate Budget Subcommittee on Education. And Senator Laird, as you all know, is a former Assembly member and chair of the Assembly Budget Committee, and prior to joining the Senate was former Governor Jerry Brown's director of the California Natural Resources Agency. When we last spoke to Senator Laird, about a year ago, he was just back from a trip to Glasgow, Scotland for the 26th Annual UN Climate Conference of Parties, or COP26 as they call it, where he and a delegation of colleagues had gone to represent California's international climate leadership. And as we speak, he is repacking his bags to be in attendance starting next week at the COP27 conference, this time in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. So we are lucky to have this brief window of chance to break some podcast bread with the honorable senator from the 17th Senate District. Good to see you again, Senator Laird.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me, and thanks for calling me the dean. That's fascinating.
I figured if that title sticks.
Well, I'm technically a freshman.
Well, we discussed that before. The freshman, but not really.
Yes, with an asterisk.
Yeah. A freshman, but you've been in the halls of the campus for a long time. How are you, by the way? How are things going this fall? How's every life in the 17th?
Well, but I am running ragged, and it's because I have this incredible district, and I've been crisscrossing it. And the last 3 days before we taped this are a perfect example. I did 20 events over 3 days in San Luis Obispo County. And the middle day, I took a 200-mile road trip and only left San Luis Obispo County for 2 miles, I think, where we had to cross over Kern County in the far eastern, southeastern part of the county.
Well, you have a lot of 2022 budget bounty for the district, too, correct?
Well, funny you should say that, because after I welcomed University of California Natural Resources Program Conference on Climate Change and Oaks in San Luis Obispo with 250 people. I was there sort of morning welcome and keynote, and then ran out to the car. And the first stop was a ranch called the Camada Ranch, and it's between Santa Margarita and Shandon, and it's a 32,000-acre ranch.
I know right where that is.
And
yes.
I managed to get $2.5 million in the state budget to start the process to conserve the ranch with a permanent easement. And the ranch family took me up to the overlook, and from every direction, one direction you could see the mountains overlooking Hearst Castle, and the other direction the mountains at the base of the Salinas Valley, and then you could see the Temblor Range that is by the San Andreas Fault that separates San Luis Obispo and Kern County, and then you could see the Cuyama, the mountains there, which splits into 3 different counties, Kern, Santa Barbara, and San Luis Obispo. And then we were on the Carrizo Plain, which is a national monument,
yes.
and it was breathtaking. We were up on that overlook when the rain was just coming down the valley, and there was just this sort of tornado of mist and a rainbow, and this long, white former lake. It was just breathtaking.
This is beautiful. You should text this to the Tourist Bureau. This is a beautiful description. Well, you have a lovely district, and as I brought up here at the beginning, I know it seems quiet here in Sacramento, but it's a busy time for all of you and your colleagues as you get ready for the fall and the new year. And actually, I do want to talk about this past year's legislation and how it affects you and the rest of California, and I'll do that in a minute. But first, I want to talk about the anticipated agenda for COP27 in Egypt. I know that world leaders will be back in attendance to kind of shore up and affirm the agreements that they all reached in Scotland last year and taking the temperature, so to speak, of the further climate action amidst what seems to be almost weekly advisories and red flags from the United Nations all over the world about just our growing and worsening climate condition. So what are you anticipating yourself, assuming you're going in a delegation of colleagues, from this conference in Egypt?
Well, the interesting thing is that when you interviewed me last year and came out of Glasgow, I said I was disappointed. I thought there should have been stronger action. And that the great thing about that conference is there were thousands and thousands of people on the ground doing different things. That was the perfect thing to understand and hear about and mix with people. But the commitments at the overall top level, I wish had been stronger. And when we head into this one, we're finding out that some of them haven't been met or they don't have the results that people anticipated. And so it's going to be that same dichotomy where we're going to see people doing amazing things, and then we're going to see if the leaders of the world come to some agreement that really has teeth and is going to move us along. And it's interesting because this morning as we tape this, I helped with a groundbreaking in Scotts Valley, which is in my district in Santa Cruz County. And it's doing these more efficient lights that will save all this electricity and keep manufacturing jobs in California. And a few weeks ago, I toured this foam company in Santa Cruz. It's taking styrofoam and reprocessing it into biodegradable, reusable packaging products. And I visited also in the northern tip of my district a new firm that is taking solar panels but really packaging them as roofing tiles. So you just get re-roofed normally and plug it in. And that's how you have solar. You don't have the panels elevated. You're not hammering into your roof. And so I am seeing all these things on the ground that people are doing that are really changing things. And I'm hoping that we're bringing those ideas and that spirit to see what everybody else is doing and then pressure the people at the top.
Well, do you feel like you have some agency as a member of the California delegation, California being a world leader on this issue, to speak up a little bit to the higher-ups on this?
Absolutely.
Good.
Because after this year, last year we had a good year on budget and fire and water and trying to deal with resiliency and adaptation, but we didn't necessarily have a good year on the top-level policy. This year, we reversed that completely. We probably had the most productive legislative session on climate that has ever been had, and it was done in this piecemeal way. And so
at the 11th hour, to some degree, too.
The governor's part was at the 11th hour.
Right.
The Senate's part was at the beginning of the race. And it's for the uninitiated, after last year, the Senate president said, we're not going to be in that same place again. So she appointed a 12-senator working group on climate that cut across political divides and geographic divides and diverse divides. And then she says, you're going to chair it. And so we had 25 meetings, and the first 9 were stakeholders. We met with building trades unions, regular non-trades unions, environmental justice advocates, more mainstream environmental organizations, business, local government, energy providers. And then we sat down to try to figure out what we could agree on.
Because you got to get these bills out.
Yes, and hammer them.
Yes.
And we really hammered on them, and we did not get to a couple of them. We could never quite on our own get to any agreement on carbon capture, but for the first time we brought people to the table, and they were actually talking substantively. But we did things on doing interim goals so we could kickstart our electricity generation, information sharing between agencies because confidentiality had been slowing down projects. We approved a high road labor agreement. We dealt with electric vehicles and trying to make them more affordable and trying to make sure that electricity islands were attacked, including apartment complexes and places where people can't do it. Well capping was really limited, and that's a big methane source in California. We had a whole, under Senator Lamone's leadership, a member of the group and her own bill, and we did a great bill there. So we really moved it along, and we moved every tough bill off the Senate floor. Then the governor showed up with his 4 proposals, and then he adopted our big bill that I was the lead author on as his 5th.
That was SB 1020, right?
Yes.
And that's the one that helped us focus on and project deadlines and targets for the future here in the state to work towards regarding climate change. And you want to give us some of the details on
yes, I think the real good way of saying it is that we have these goals for 2035 or 2045, some of them, and it's just like somehow we'll be at that goal in that year. And yet you have to meet certain benchmarks, and you have to know you're beating the benchmarks, and you have to shoot for it. And that's what that bill did, is it really said, okay, here are the benchmarks along the way that are going to make sure that we're moving ourselves toward these targets and being able to measure that we're moving along satisfactorily.
So as you get to these targets, just doing an assessment, if you will, right? About just, how close
funny
are we
you should say that, because the other bill I did that was one of them was that we sort of have to rely on different reports or news agencies to know exactly where we are against the targets. I did a bill that now creates a climate dashboard of all these indicators from the agencies to make sure we know exactly where we are against the goals at a given time.
California has been positioned for a long time as the climate leader here in the world, understandably and obviously. And I actually, in a goodbye episode I did a few weeks ago with Senator Wieckowski, I asked him about this too. California is constantly being taken to task for at once both resting on its laurels and not doing enough, not working harder to reach these deadlines and these goals, but simultaneously also being accused of being too risky and moving too fast and declaring fossil-free alternative energy goals for the future while we can barely fight fires and pay for gas and keep the lights on now. So I think when we talked about this kind of tension, when you came back from COP26, you kind of called it a nuance. So what's your perspective on that tension and that struggle and that
actually,
nuance?
the tension is the tension between how we felt last year and what we did this year. That is exactly the tension. And I might have used an analogy with you once before, which is really interesting to me, because everybody argues goals. And I had this debate with Senator Dawley on the floor about 1020. He said, these are just goals. What comes of goals? And I said, I'm the one legislator here that was in the legislature when Assembly Bill 32 was adopted in 2006 and started this.
Right.
And we said, since the United States government was walking away from the Kyoto protocols, which came from another COP, another international climate conference, the United States walked away from it, so we said, okay, we'll put those goals on California. And what it really said is by 2020, we would return to the emissions of the level of 1990, and that is roughly anywhere from 10 to 15% of a reduction in emissions. Well, we met that goal, but we didn't have the specific way we were going to do it. What we did is we assigned it to the Air Board. We gave them money, and we gave them regulatory authority, and they figured it out. And I think politically, if you were going to say, we're going to attack diesel trucks, you'd have trouble approving that because you would have siloed it out as one thing. But if you have people that have to say, we have to reduce this much, let's see where we can do it in the sector, it's an easier way to look at it and do it. But the point being, we made that goal. And then Jerry Brown said in 2011, we'll have 33% of our electricity portfolio renewable by 2020. We met that goal 2 years early. And then when I was a mayor in Jurassic times, it's like, I think 34 years ago, Byron Scher authored the bill on landfills, and he said, we will divert 50% of what goes into landfills. I tell this story all the time. I did it on the floor in the debate because I said at the time, great goal. I love it. It'll never happen. And then we got to 60% diverted, that we actually did it. And when I was sworn in to the Santa Cruz City Council 40 years ago, the city manager says, you know, we have about 20 years life left on the landfill. If you stay here long enough, you'll be here to close this landfill and to site the next one. And that landfill in 1981, it had 20 years life left. In now 2022, has 30 years life left. There is a chance, and that's 40 years later.
Yeah,
it has grown in the life because of how efficient we have been in recycling. And,
and another example of one of those on-the-ground success stories of how this is actually working. How these goals are being met.
And so when Senator Dawley said, see, this is just a goal, I said, they said that about that. And I might have even said it about it, but look what happened. And same with electricity and renewables, and same with emissions. And so these goals mean something. But looking forward, and we'll get to that in a bit, that's our next task, is to make sure they do mean something. And in going to Egypt, it is really looking at what other people do. Is there something we should do? And I hesitate to sunshine one issue I discovered this week, but when I'm in eastern San Luis Obispo County, I go to the Topaz solar farm. And it was the biggest one, I think, or the second biggest one in the nation when it was first built, whenever that was, 10 or 12 years ago. And they have an agreement with PG&E for a certain amount to sell them. I want to say 550 megawatts. It's a lot of electricity. And PG&E, that was the beginning. They gave them a good rate. They probably pay them 5 or 6 times what they would get if they would negotiate it now that it's more plentiful and they have different experience. Well, then they tell us that they have the capacity to generate 25 or 50 megawatts more, but it's not allowable under the PG&E agreement, so they don't generate it. And I suspect if I went and talked to PG&E, they said, that's right, because they would have to have us pay them a lot less because they got a sweetheart deal. So on one side, they don't want to break open the sweetheart deal. On another side, all of us should want more electricity that is there for the taking, renewables. And so we got to figure out a way that we can satisfy both sides and get some more energy on the grid, renewable energy. And so, because that was the task coming out of this year, and we haven't talked about Diablo Canyon yet, but it's a piece of that.
Just about to.
And that is the thing. How do we get more electricity onto the grid, and particularly renewable?
Well, speaking of renewables, speaking of electricity on the grid, speaking of San Luis Obispo County, speaking of the tensions that we are talking about here between what can happen in the future and what is happening now, one thing that did play out in the legislative session in August, as California transitions to 100% carbon-free energy, there's still the power gaps, the potential embarrassing blackouts, even though we really haven't seen them as much this year. And that led Governor Newsom and the legislature to revisit the scheduled closing date of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant in San Luis Obispo, in your district, scheduled to power down by 2025. A bill was crafted right at the ledge deadline, passed and signed into law. Many business groups, even some environmentalists, supported the decision to keep the plant open. Most environmental groups and the nuclear watchdog and nuclear safety groups decried the plan. They were stunned by it. As the senator with a working nuclear plant in your district, you insisted that some important firewalls, if you will, be put into the bill before you and many of your colleagues would support it, and to include, at least as you put it, the minimum things necessary to not impact California and the coast in negative ways. So walk us through this history, this 11th hour decision, and what happened, and the current future of Diablo Canyon. I mean, were you as stunned as the Enviro and nuclear watchdog groups?
I was stunned in April. And what happened was, and it's a good story to tell.
Yes.
I'm just in my office one day on an afternoon in April, and the governor's office calls and says, we just want you to know the governor just met with the Los Angeles Times, and he suggested that he might be open to extending the life of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. So I go out, find my chief of staff and some others, and I think it's just one of those offhand comments that gets made that they were probably kicking him. Why did you say that? No business. And we do a little reconnaissance, and in about 24 hours, we discover, holy crap, he's been negotiating with the feds already. There's all this stuff happen. There might be money on the table. This is real. And so Well, exactly as you set it up in the question, there's about 10 issues that you couldn't even consider doing this unless you addressed. The seismic safety had changed, and there had been additional studies about the faults near there, and yet with a 2025 closure date, a big push to retrofit or push on that had slowed down. That needed to be addressed. Same with deferred maintenance. Under a bill that my predecessor, Senator Bill Monning, did, $80 million in transition to soften the blow had gone out to San Luis Obispo County. They shouldn't have to pay it back, and it should be replenished for the time that it might close. The original proposals generally wanted to override regulatory authority, and for me, overriding the Coastal Commission was a non-starter.
Right.
And we have offshore wind scheduled to come on in that area in it would be 5 years after the plant was scheduled to close, 2029, 2030, if everything went well. And you need transmission, and you want the transmission from the nuclear power plant. So you're hoping that you develop all this new offshore wind and that transmission is there. And there wasn't enough fuel to take the plant past 2025. There wasn't enough cask storage for nuclear waste.
Well, and as even you had pointed out, there may not be the workers. People were retiring.
Exactly.
With the anticipation that the plant was shutting down.
Exactly. And then you have the global issue of the fact that we're talking about this because there's not enough electricity on the grid, so we need more electricity. We need it with Diablo. We need it without Diablo. And the funny thing is so I called for a Marshall Plan of renewable energy. In the San Luis Obispo paper, this dates some of us. Every time they covered it, they put in parentheses, the Marshall Plan was a post-World War II thing, and they had to explain the historic reference because only a few of us that were older understood the historic reference. It made me laugh every time I read it in the San Luis Obispo newspaper. And so the thing about it is right afterwards, I really met with the governor's office and said, and they felt like I was key as somebody that's environmental, somebody that, represents the district, that if they had me shooting, they were not in a good position. And I was very careful to say, I have no position on this. I'm waiting to see how you satisfy all these things. And so then it comes up in the June budget, and the budget is in the last half of June. We've landed it on the governor's desk. We're negotiating how it'll be signed. And this was the last issue. And I talked with the person in the governor's office doing this, and it was like, well, why do you need any of this if you say the decision will be made in August? They said, well, we do need two things. If we don't get in line for the nuclear fuel, we don't get in line for the storage for the spent fuel, we might not have it available in August. So we need to get in line for that. And I said, but this other stuff, do you need it now? And they said, no. And it's like, well, then the only things that should be in there are those two things. And if you're saying this is not a decision, then we need to publicly say, putting these two things is not a decision. It just enables the possibility of a decision in August. They agreed. I talked to Cal Matters within a day or two, floated that. So it's in an article that this is not the decision. This is just enabling it. And then they went on and ground truthing in negotiations. And I think in August, we were hoping they'd have a proposal when we came back from the recess in August. And they were, I think, they realized this was a little harder than they thought it was going to be. They're ground truthing the offshore wind and all this. And then they float a proposal, and I don't think the public understood it because it was a $1.4 billion forgivable loan that everybody has fixated on. But basically, there's a federal pot of money.
Right.
And the federal pot of money could offset any costs here. But PG&E has to approve a loss.
And California has to apply for the funds, too,
yes,
right?
And actually PG&E has to apply because they're going to demonstrate a loss. So they demonstrate a loss of $1.4 billion, and yet we have to float the loan before it's reimbursed. And so we asked for assurances or guarantees. This wouldn't be at risk to the taxpayers. It wouldn't be at risk to the electricity ratepayers. We would only appropriate it as it was needed, and PG&E stockholders could get no profits off of this loan. All those things were accepted. And we had an additional guardrail that in the event that their projection showed that there would be enough energy that Diablo didn't have to be extended, then they would go ahead with the original date. And then they addressed every single issue. Coastal Commission could compress their process, but not overridden. One that I didn't mention is there's 12,000 acres of land around it that are ecologically sensitive. We want those protected. They said the San Luis Obispo people don't have to pay back the money, and there will still be differentials for workers to work to the last day. And there'll be seismic study, deferred maintenance study. They originally wanted a 10-year extension. They limited it to 5, so it's ready for the offshore wind to come on. In the end, much to my surprise, they addressed every issue I laid on the table.
Wow.
You know, and so I felt like I had no option but to support this by then. But I was very careful not to say what my position was all the way along, because I was waiting to see what they would do.
No, that was actually, in my opinion, wise to hold your cards close to the vest there on that. Well, I know a Stanford team had previously suggested turning the closed plant and the property into a polygeneration facility that would include seawater desal and hydrogen fuel factory for fuel cell vehicles. And as with nuclear power, even those projects aren't without environmental consequence, but from what I understand, that wasn't even in the bill. That's now off the table.
Yeah, or it's not part of this. And you see, the thing is the thing that triggered this in the first place, like a year and a half ago, were two former energy secretaries, Ernest Moniz and Stephen
from
Chu,
the Obama administration.
Yes, suggesting that this be extended. And at the time, I was really irritated because it was sort of like, well, how nice of you to parachute in and talk about the high-level thing and just blissfully not address any of the issues that I just outlined to you, because it was like, oh, somebody else can deal with that. We only deal with things at high level. Now go figure this out, when it was as complicated as I just explained to you. So I was not happy when they first did that.
Well, you participated in a workshop recently with the Governor's Office, the Energy Commission, CalISO, the Independent Systems Operator, where information was shared, concerns were aired. So moving forward, are you feeling positive that the Newsom administration seems committed to making Diablo's renewed lease on life as short as possible? Do you have faith that fast forward 5 years from now?
Well, that's us to do as well. And the thing is we got $1.1 billion in that bill for renewable energy to kickstart electricity. And so I think that is our challenge heading into the next year. That's the reason I brought up going to the Topaz solar farm and seeing that there might be more energy there.
Right.
Because when we were in the climate working group, there were just these sidebar stories of, oh, there's some renewables and the grid isn't accessing it. It wasn't, this was a different story. But nevertheless, because one of the interesting things is, to complete the round on this, is I think the day we approved it was the first day of the 10-day heat wave in September. Imagine what would have happened if that 10-day heat wave had actually been the last 10 days of session.
Yes.
It might have been different. And there were a couple of times where issues we had just debated were right at the fore. For example, a lot of advocates said, you're doing these projections and you're just saying that there can't be much of a demand response, that you can't ask the public to lower demand. And then in that 10 days, there was this notice sent out to 2.7 million utility users in California, and it demonstrates that they dropped their use precipitously in the half hour or whatever after that notice went out. Now, I understand human nature. You probably can't do that more than 2 or 3 times a year, but it showed that you could do it.
And it also shows that people, Californians, are buying into this.
Yes.
They understand what's going on.
And I think one of the stories that is not fully written yet out of that heat wave is the role of battery storage. And there's 2 big plants in my district, and the largest one is proposed for my district that hasn't been built. Moss Landing, former fossil fuel plant. Now PG&E and Vistra have battery storage. The former plant that still has 3 towers in Morro Bay, Vistra's proposing putting a huge battery storage there. So you see, it's this classic thing where you have nuclear and 2 fossil fuels, and you can turn them into the hub for offshore wind and battery storage. But in both a transition away from some things to renewables. But the interesting thing is that for a few hours at the height of that heat wave, 1.5 times the energy that comes out of Diablo Canyon came from battery storage. And the battery storage that is already in place probably helped the grid from going down in that key time. So you see, another thing is there something we should be doing? Right now, it's totally the market. Is there something we should be doing to facilitate that? And then, since there's somebody listening in my district that's screaming right now, there was a small fire at one of them in Moss Landing a few weeks ago. And there was a shelter in place for, 12 hours. Highway 1 was closed for 12 or 14 hours. I was going to speak to the Monterey County Board of Supervisors, and I had to find all these back country roads and get around and get there in time to speak to the Board of Supervisors. So there's this real concern that battery storage isn't safe. And so I think I want to come back. There was a bill that said the PUC has to examine safety things, and we're looking at it to see if that's enough. But I really think there should be fire and safety plans for battery storage plants because we need them.
Yes.
But we also need the people around to have a sense of security that they are safe. And so I might look at whether legislation needs to be done to do that. And I've talked to some of them, and, some of them are queasy, but there's at least one that says, anything you would require, we do. We welcome that. Just give it to us.
Wow. Okay.
And so that's fascinating to me. And so you can tell that there's a lot that came out of this last year, but it points us to the lot that we still have to do.
Yes, and I know, as you've brought up here, too, is the diversity of sources, diversity of power, the key to reducing emissions, finding alternative sources of energy in an affordable and equitable way. And in Glasgow, last fall, you took a boat ride out into the North Sea to visit and learn about the Scottish offshore windmills that are generating alternative energy. I know you were excited because of the offshore wind energy possibilities on the horizon for California's coast, particularly 2 spots, one up in Humboldt County and one off of Morro Bay, which, of course, is in your district. And fast forward to this year, the California Energy Commission has approved plans, I understand, for generating 25 gigawatts of energy from the offshore wind farms, as they call it, by 2045. 11 times more energy, actually, than Diablo Canyon. And that offshore wind power could account for a quarter, maybe even half of the state's future energy needs. So tell us about that visit to the North Sea, and I can see your eyes light up when I talk about it, and share your excitement about this offshore wind energy that we can see closer to home.
In the interest of making sure that there's harmony among the houses, I should mention that I horned in on an assembly trip.
Yes, and
they let me come with a number, and so I'm very grateful for that.
You did actually mention that. It was an assembly trip, yes.
And the thing is
a long train ride and then the boat ride.
It was a 3-hour train ride to Aberdeen, and then we met with the people and went out in the boats. And the interesting thing, and I might have described it last year, is there's a person from one of the wind energy companies, and when I was resources secretary, she talked to me about floating wind turbines, and I was poo-pooing it. Floating, really? Denmark is shallow. All these other places are shallow. We go deep immediately off of California. It is really rocky. Float, really? And then when I saw it, I got it. And there are underwater platforms that help the water pressure stabilize. They can bring the cords down on the ocean floor. And the thing is that we already have cables for telecommunications and other things. That's not the environmental disturbance that some people think it might be. So this is really doable. The thing that you just mentioned about the 2 off of California, they're both different, not just the location, but as I mentioned earlier, you could even use part of the transmission out of the former Morro Bay power plant or out of Diablo Canyon. Up in Humboldt, they don't have the transmission. They are going to have to do a Marshall Plan on transmission to try to figure out how to meet the time that energy will be available, or there won't be easy ways to put it on the California grid. And so Senator McGuire has been really concerned about this and working on it, but I intend to come back and say, how can I help? It's like in whatever way, we need to recognize that you've been really carrying the weight on this, but this is a statewide issue, and we need to alert people around the state in a way that they all should be supporting this.
Well, to Senator McGuire's concerns, probably, what are the possible effects of the wind farms on commercial fishing and the marine wildlife habitat? Are those impacts being addressed on this coast as we consider this energy?
Glad you asked. And I believe it's the state. I don't know if it's the Lands Commission or the Energy Commission or some subcontractor has contracted with some environmental scientists to actually tease out these issues. And they happen to be from the Monterey Bay area, and I have met with them and basically said, while I strongly support wind energy, I don't want serious marine or aviary impacts on species. And so I'm hoping that you will ground truth this in a way that if there's a way to mitigate it, we have a path. And what is it actually? And it's interesting because if you cycle back in my career, I cut my teeth 35 years ago as a mayor opposing offshore oil. And one of our concerns is that these rigs were going to go out there in the middle of sea lanes, and those same issues are now being addressed here.
Well, I know that the federal climate bill, offshore wind development, has been tied to offshore fossil fuel production. I know California has marine sanctuary laws about drilling and offshore oil. Will that prevent that challenge from affecting us if we go forward with this?
No, but only because it would prevent it if it were in these existing marine sanctuaries.
Right.
Because that is where it's done. But they are outside. And it's interesting because there's bunches of us that are advocates for a Shumash sanctuary to connect with the Monterey Bay sanctuary to the south.
The Native American sanctuary.
Yeah, so you're off of southern Monterey, San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and there's been work done, in my view, to make sure that you can have the sanctuary and it will not overlap with where the offshore wind turbines will be, so that they are mutually exclusive. And yet we all support this, and Salud Carbajal, who's the Congress member who overlaps with my Senate district in that area, has really taken the lead at the federal elected level, and I'm supporting him. But exactly the things that you raised that Senator McGuire is dealing with, let's just say the fishermen in Morro Bay are grumpy.
Sure. Well, I imagine they are up in Humboldt, too, as well, for all that they've had to deal with.
Although I think that there's this real idea to work it out.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Well, there's probably going to be more study. And like you say, as you come back here to the new session, there's a lot more issues to be dealt with on this. And speaking of that, as you get ready to come back to the new session with swearing in on December 5th and starting in January, working with a re-elected governor who has called a special session right from the start to focus on the high gas prices. Again, that thing that people are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. They've been dealing with this all year. And the proposed windfall tax on the oil industry. And the governor says the soaring gasoline prices we've experienced this year are greedy and manipulative, that he calls it just rank price gouging. And the analysts have said it's just maintenance-related shutdowns. The governor disagrees with that. The Republicans are saying if we do this, the fossil fuel industry is just going to pass the costs of all of this on to the consumers. What do you think about all of this? Are you ready to vote for a gas tax come December?
I'm anxious to see what the proposal is, which is a whole other story.
Right.
But the thing is that if you look at the profits, they are off the charts. They are just off the charts. Maintenance, be damned. It is like these are just record profits at a time of the highest prices. And so there's a point. But then how do you do this? And that was interesting because when he said he wanted to call the legislature back into special session, the Speaker and the Senate President issued a joint statement and said they anxiously await his specific proposal.
Yes.
And it's so do I.
So I know they're dealing with these proposals right now, and it'll be in front of you by December 5th.
You see, let me speak as a politician for a moment, which I don't usually. You're asking 40 new legislators to vote on
that was my next
the first thing they do. That just seems to be crazy.
Yes.
It's not taking into account what their reality is.
Well, their ink is still drying on their new business cards, and you're already having them voting on a tax increase.
And the interesting thing about that is, and of course some of them might feel freer to do it because of that. They're not anchored to to stuff. And my advice, it's interesting because I arrived in the legislature with 17 years in local elected office and even longer as a staff member for local government and agencies. So I was grounded. I sort of had a sense of who I was. There are a lot of legislators that come in that have never held elected office before.
That's right.
More and more. I have worked with some really closely, and they struggle at the beginning. There's one I was particularly close to, was from my region, who was agonizing over every vote. And I said, you're going to have 18,000 votes. You have to do what you think is right and move on. And you also have to decide early where your lines are. Like, what is a bridge too far? Where's something that just compromises me that I'm not going to get to? And if you draw those lines early, it's much easier after that. You understand, public doesn't understand, you can defend it. But imagine drawing that line as your first vote on raising billions of dollars of windfall oil taxes.
You've drawn that line just at the very beginning, and it's going to affect the rest of your term and how you adjust to it.
I mean, I think the governor has a point. There's no arguing that. But I want to see his specific proposal on how he proposes to address it, and then we can sort of poke at it and see if it stands up and if there's unintended consequences or what it really does. And the argument frequently is this will just raise prices on the people you are trying to help. And so, and there have been some talk about we'll take the taxes and lower the prices of rebates, give it right back in the pocket. So that's why I'm anxious to see what the governor specifically proposes, because it might answer some of these questions.
Well, we are anxious to know a little bit more detail, notwithstanding what we've already talked about, some of your other legislative priorities for this next year budget and otherwise that are stewing in the pot as you get ready for the new session.
The thing about it is yes, we have talked about some, and I really have to look at electricity. And following on what we did last year, we created some momentum, but we have to keep it going. So, but I also chair the education budget subcommittee, and I think we were so focused on getting schools more support, then I think we have to start to have a conversation about what are the results of that support. And we're looking at teacher retention. We're looking at facilities. We just had some student test scores that were challenging.
Yes, absolutely.
Although
not surprising, but challenging.
It was from COVID.
Yeah.
And it was interesting that there were some that went up. And so I think that the question is this year, that it's going to be tighter financially and tighter in the education world. Let's focus on the specific challenges or problems and how are we meeting them and what can we do? Because I think mental health, counseling for students, particularly in disadvantaged communities, teacher retention. You see, the teacher retirement information lags. And so we were having hearings where they could not give us a clear understanding of how many people retired during COVID. And the applications for one particular time that we had hearings were 3 times the normal for retiring. And that's misleading because maybe there's tons of PE teachers. I'm going to get in trouble for whatever analogy I choose. Tons of teachers in one category, but then we're short in math and science, or we're short in something else. And so how do we make sure that some of those that are the basis of the test scores is not where we're having teacher shortages or problems? So I think this year, if I stick with that chairmanship, which I would love to do, but God knows what will present itself, that's the way I would want to focus on.
Well, for the past 2 years, everybody's been focusing on everything wrong with California, the exoduses allegedly of people moving to other states, the challenges and the crisis we've had in the schools, the wildfires, the power shutdowns, and everything negative that was going on. But nobody was paying attention to, well, at least collectively, to the economic growth and robust budgets. And there's now predictions from some economists this fall that California could soon surpass Germany to become the world's 4th largest economy. Now, there's still some debate of whether that's just Germany's struggle that we are just able to hopscotch above, or if we're actually seeing that growth in the economy, notwithstanding the fact that a recession could be on the horizon. What do you think about this? This new?
Well, I always think that it's one of those things where everybody takes their general political viewpoint and tries to create facts that support it. And yes, I think that one of the things in the pandemic drove it home, the cost of living on the California coast is off the charts. And so I think the pandemic cut the tie for some people that were hanging by a thread. And yet, it's like I was talking about going this morning to that dedication. Here's a brand new green business. They're going to employ 100 people in manufacturing in the high housing market along the coast. And the other one I mentioned with foam, they're expanding rapidly. And they're in this huge old Wrigley plant in Santa Cruz that was empty and they had trouble renting. And now they can't find extra space. Everything is booming.
Yeah.
And so I feel like there's a story here and people are trying to write it at what their high-level political beliefs are. And I'm not sure. And San Francisco downtown is not totally coming back. So there's all these things where there's transitions. And I might have mentioned before, because I think it happened just before the last show, there's some very fine restaurant in Pismo Beach, and I'm Zooming with their Chamber of Commerce, and they said that this restaurant reopened after COVID, and they did not have a service employee after COVID that was there before COVID. And
Wow.
So there are dislocations and changes that are good and challenging that are under that. I tend to believe that, who knows, maybe Germany is whatever, but we're strong and we're growing in certain ways, and we have to meet the challenges.
Are you excited about the new session, meeting your new colleagues, whether they're seasoned political veterans or not? Are you looking forward to it?
I am, and I've met a lot of them that I think are coming in. And, you know, I was at a dinner at the Monterey Aquarium for a state agriculture group a couple of weeks ago, and I welcomed everybody there. And then I sat next to somebody that is odds-on an incoming senator that's a non-incumbent. And until he got tired of us talking shop, I was, what do you want to serve on? What do you want to do? How do you see your role? And it was really encouraging. I thought, this guy's good. So here's one that is coming, and I think we're going to have some new talent. I'm really looking forward to it.
That's wonderful to hear. Post-election, U.S. and California, and the blurring and fading line between the rhetorical extremism and the political violence. The attack on Paul Pelosi, Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband, just this last week as we speak, shocked even those who have become inured to this rising political violence here in the U.S. Norms being eroded, conspiracy theories becoming mainstream argument, and our society is more and more, and it doesn't seem like it's just hyperbole to say this, that it looks like we're coming apart at the seams, that democracy's fragile. People at the threshold of being elected to office that deny the legitimacy of the last election. And there was a UC Davis report from their Center on Violence just this week that said roughly 5 million Americans would be willing to kill someone to achieve a political purpose. Now, you have been a lawmaker here in California for a generation plus in the public eye. What the hell's going on?
Well, it's scary. I have to say it's scary.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm somebody that believes in reasoning with people, talking to all people, trying to work it out. And so that is really disappointing. And the Paul Pelosi thing is just off the charts troubling. And I've been trying to think, how do you make sure that people understand the power to vote, understand their power to participate in the democracy, understand that the will of the majority actually stands for something, and work through this. And, you know, there's all these practical things, which is we're clearly not teaching enough in school about constitutional democracy and its importance and its fragility. But we just have to keep working at this. And, you know, it's funny, I spoke to just yesterday. I'm sitting in Sacramento. Yesterday, I was the luncheon speaker at the San Luis Obispo Rotary Club. And I get this question. in the question period of about exactly this. And they went off on a tangent where it's like, why isn't there more protection? And sort of like, and they were asking me about Paul Pelosi, and I said, well, actually, apparently it was on a TV. Somebody could have seen it, but nobody was hired to sit there and watch the TV. So yes, there is a question of resources. But you're talking about the underlying issue regardless of the resources, and I think that's what we really have to attack. And it is scary because it should, you know, violence should never be the way we resolve things.
Indeed. On a more hopeful note, as I let you go, when we first talked in your first couple of months in office, you were excited about the fact that you'd been doing genealogy and you had just established a family genealogy website. And the few times I've asked you about it, I see you on the floor, and you're always very excited about it. How is that going?
I'm always adding to it, and it's like I've been stressed the last month. I haven't been. I'll put a new page up about 2 weeks ago but I'd been working on it for 3 months, and I just started 10 new pages. 8 of them are about Danish ancestors, where
wow.
I've done all this research, and it's very funny because I don't speak Danish, and so I find a census thing for like a third great-grandfather, and it turns out his job was forest warden. That's what it translated to, forest warden.
Okay,
and,
great.
And I have an oral history that says, oh, yes, the family lived and worked in the forest forever. And this is one of those rare moments where they immigrated and they were photographers, and so I have about 50 pictures of the family in Denmark and after they immigrated, and I don't know if anybody else in the family has them, so I'm trying to get them in good quality, post them, explain them, connect them to who people are. And you know, it's weird because my mother, this is one where I overlapped. For a year and a half, my great-grandmother, who was a Danish immigrant, you know, I have a picture of her bouncing me when I had just been born,
wow.
so there was a connection,
yeah,
time-wise. And she said to my mother and her brother and sister, yes, we came over on the boat. It took forever. We never thought we would get there, this whole business. And then I find out that her youngest brother was born on the boat. The first censuses say birthplace Atlantic Ocean. And I just keep thinking, what's in your mind to have 7 kids and an 8th one born while you're on the water, and you know, and now all the offshore wind is off of where my family immigrated from, and there was something, I don't know, a beet famine, some kind of famine, and I told some Danish delegation, my family left your area because there was a beet famine, or whatever kind of famine it was, and so I'm still on it.
That's awesome. That's awesome. See, this is the stuff that matters too, the ties that bind and the family history. So I'm glad you're still working on it, and get that page up as soon as possible.
I will.
It is a pleasure to talk to you. I'm so glad you're part of the Senate family. It is just fun to talk to you and sit at the foot of the dean, the master here, for an hour. Safe travels to Egypt, and we'll hear about it hopefully in the next few months, and look forward to legislation in the new year. And thank you, Senator Laird, for joining us here again on Then There's California.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for just the substantive questions.
Oh, I love it. It's been delicious. Thank you. That wraps this edition of Then There's California. We are proud to have technical and production assistance and great ideas from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulty, Brian Shadden, Ann DeGrazia, John Roman, Lisa Murphy, McLeana Woods, and the graphic artistry of Tim Davis. I'm Brian Green from the state capitol in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.